Hello and welcome to this special interview with London's 2021 mayoral candidates. My name is Jason Okindaya and I'll be hosting this interview with Siân Berry. This event has been organised by the Home of Black British History, the Black Cultural Archives, whose mission is to collect, preserve and celebrate the histories of people of African and Caribbean descent in the UK. The questions asked today have been sent in by BCA's social media audience. So I'd like to welcome Siân Berry. Hello, Siân.
Hello, really nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's lovely to be here. And are you having a good week?
It's a busy week. It's 1 week to go today until the election. So there's a lot of things to be done, but it's going well. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's get straight into it. So obviously, we've seen this month the uproar surrounding the release of the Race Commission's report into racism and racial inequality. I want to know from your perspective: does institutional racism exist, and what do you plan to do about it as Mayor of London?
It does. I see examples of it in my work all of the time. So I'm standing for mayor, but I'm currently a London Assembly member and I'm standing to stay on the London Assembly as well. And I've been on the Police and Crime Committee in the London Assembly all of that time. And we have seen example after example of any kind of use of force by police, any kind of new tactic, whether that's facial recognition being tested, in Newham, these kinds of things come up over and over again. I've seen it with taser use, spit hood use, stop and search, very famously, and then also in the enforcement of the coronavirus restrictions. That was done disproportionately against Black Londoners, and it's a pattern that we see over and over again. And I was really disappointed when I tackled Cressida Dick, the Commissioner of Police, about that particular new example of disproportionality. And she said effectively, and I'm not quoting exactly, but she effectively said that's the same disproportion you see in everything, and therefore it's not wrong. It's just, and I'm like, well, that is a clear example of where, the biases that exist within individual officers. The idea is they were going to engage with people first about coronavirus restrictions, and then try and talk to people and educate them about the rules, and then only finally go on to enforcement. And you can totally see how the biases of officers, the unconscious biases in often different cases, would lead people across that line to enforcement sooner for different groups. And that was happening. Tried to get them to take it seriously, and it was just sort of fobbed off. So yes, I see that with the police a lot, but I also see it in other areas. I work a lot in housing, and I've got some evidence, and I'm going to do further work on this if I'm re-elected, that it is more difficult for people of colour, particularly women of colour, to get good service out of housing from local councils, to get the homes that they need, to get onto the list for a bigger home, to get things fixed. There's clear examples there of things that occur within institutions that are either putting barriers up in terms of the administration, making it harder to get through, or people's concerns not being taken as seriously. It's all through our society, and the race report tried to gloss over that and pretend it wasn't a problem, and it's just completely wrong. It was set up to do that by the Prime Minister. He handpicked the people to run that commission and produce that report to reach that conclusion. And in 2021, after the year we've had in 2020, after the real outpouring of support for Black Lives Matter protests, it's just not good enough to have done that. It's genuinely a disgrace.
And I want to pick up on some of the stuff that you said there about, the police commissioner and facial recognition technologies. I think for, our Black audiences, one of the major concerns with institutional racism has been the institution of the Metropolitan Police. And from what you're saying, it does seem like you've experienced, some resistance and some denial of the issue at the top level of the institution. And I want to quote some stats. So during lockdown, from March to May 2020, around 22,000 young Black Londoners were stopped and searched. So we know the issue exists, but as Mayor of London, what would you be doing to make sure that you can really penetrate through the resistance which is coming towards the tech level, to make sure that we are having that, necessary reckoning with the police force and how it affects young Black life?
So what I've suggested in my manifesto is that we need to have a really big conversation about policing to reset it effectively according to first principles. And there are principles out there that the police are supposed to learn when they get trained, that are supposed to be at the heart of the leadership within the Met. And I don't think they are properly taken seriously. They are things like, recognizing that having a police force at all, having citizens who have power over other citizens, can be problematic, is something that you don't necessarily want to have in a healthy society. And therefore, if you do have a police service, it must be from and for the people, it must be accountable to the people, and it must be done in a way that is genuinely respectful of the fact that you, as a citizen, as a police officer citizen, having power over another citizen is not ideal. And every kind of use of force needs to be done carefully and with the utmost care. Now, those principles are set out. It also says in one of the principles, I think it's number 4, that once you reach the point of using force against citizens, you've failed. The goal always needs to be cooperation and trust and building those things up. And at the moment, I think the loss of trust has been allowed to get worse and worse and worse, and there isn't a serious mission amongst police officers to fix that. We have got an action plan from the current mayor, and the way the police are governed, the mayor is the police and crime commissioner for London, and we have a deputy mayor for policing who's supposed to oversee and challenge the police. I don't see that enough from either Sadiq Khan or his deputy mayor, Sophie Linden. But there is an action plan where they are commissioning proper external independent academic research to look into biases and look at things. But I think that'll still be a little piecemeal. I think that will look potentially at one thing and another thing and another thing, and you'll end up with some things being given some attention for a while, but the effect of that will fade. And so what I want to have, so I'm getting around to my point now, what I want to have is a citizens' assembly and a much wider conversation amongst the whole of London about what the police are for. Let's rewrite those principles for the 21st century. Let's get citizens and police officers working with them in mind all of the time. And I think only that kind of big reset will really fix all of this. We can't just go fiddling around the edges. I've seen too many times when police officers have, like I said before, made excuses for why there is disproportionality. The latest one is they're pointing to the geography, and they're saying, well, we stop and search more in these areas, and that's where more people of colour live, and therefore that's not bias. It is bias. It's institutional bias towards geography in those ways. It's just that they're not quite grasping the point, and they need to, and it means having that serious conversation with citizens where both sides are listening and everyone's trying to make things better. And I think resetting from the start would be the right thing to do.
Yeah. And returning to the race report and, that whole issue of trust, I mean, not that many Black communities had trust in this government anyway, but the commissioning of that race report has really, completely shattered relations, because we can't even say that institutional racism exists anymore. And so, what do you plan to do to address the concerns and issues raised by countless stakeholders over the process and methodology that was used to create this report? And what do you propose to kind of counter it, or to resolve and build trust in those communities who have felt manipulated and lied to by the government?
See, I hate to answer that question and say, well, we'll do our own report or we'll have our own commission. We've done this in London. The action plan, the evidence that's being gathered within that, the evidence that already exists is there. I think we have to move on to action now. Put that report in the bin and just get on with fixing the problems that we have, working together. It is something that I think has been so discredited in the media, but discredited by some of the people cited in it, that it needs to be thrown away at a London level, and just we'll get on with fixing things ourselves, working together with our citizens.
Yeah. The next question is a little bit of a long question from the public, so just bear with me. So, On the 13th of December 2007, the British government confirmed in a press statement that the 23rd of August, UNESCO's Day for the International Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition, will be adopted as the focal date for national commemorations in the years to come. The Mayor of London at the time inaugurated and hosted a commemorative event for the occasion, but this was not continued by the new mayor from 2008. The new Mayor of London in 2016 reinstituted the August 13th commemorative date in 2018. If elected as mayor in May 2021, will you commit to continuing the event throughout the entirety of your term and providing appropriate funding that is in line with commemorating such a significant piece of London and British history?
A very long question, but it sets out the history really well. And the short answer is yes, absolutely. I went to that event in 2018, the first one that was done, and it was in City Hall, and it was absolutely a really, really good event. And really, I think I put it in parallel with the event we have every year to remember the Holocaust and other genocides as well. And in those events in City Hall, we hear from survivors of the Holocaust and survivors of genocides since, and they are there to give testimony and to tell us what to think about and how to avoid these things in future. And I think having a very similar day about the history of enslaving African people and what went on is really important. Now, we can't have survivors because of the history and the length of time, but we can have people telling us about slavery today, modern slavery. We can have people coming to tell us about their experiences of continuing racism, the legacy that there is. We can also take action. We are in the Greens, we are supportive of the Stop the Mangamizi campaign that is fighting for a commission at a national level to look at the issues around reparations and atonement for the enslavement of Africans. And that is something that I think is another big conversation that society needs to have. I keep saying big conversation, but I think, we are at a point now in 21st century where we've faced some extraordinary challenges, and we've had a lot of what we were very sort of complacent with in the 20th century rocked. And it is time for people as a whole to genuinely have a think about what humanity means, what freedom means, what human rights really are, and how we make them real in the decades to come. And I think, this is something that I'm running for Mayor of London as a leader within one of the biggest cities in the world. We can do this. We are a global city. We can tackle these global issues. We're a city who's right in the history of some of these atrocities. We have whole institutions, buildings that are built on the backs of this trade. And I think, we are the city that could have this conversation, but also so many others that could set a shining example to the world. That's the London I want to be a leader of.
And I think it's interesting, you said that you speak about conversations a lot. I want to think about actions because, often the actions that people have taken, they've kind of taken at the most local and democratic level, have been, felt really frustrated by it. So, for example, what we saw in Brixton with the Edward Colston statue, where people tried to go through those democratic processes, were tired of it and just took down the statue themselves. Are you willing to go there? Are you willing to, order that the statues come down? Are you willing to really take the change to the streets and meet the people where they are and where they're frustrated? Or do you think that you'll be scared off by the talk of, the culture wars and the idea that, the woke are taking over? How are you going to really, tackle against that? Because you're going to have a government that is against you in that sense, that is, trying to flame this culture war about the kind of like protection of British heritage and history, which runs totally counter to decolonization and, reckoning with Britain's complicity and not even complicity, active role in the slave trade. So how do you plan to, kind of stand up for Black Londoners in that sense?
Yes, and I will defend and continue and make sure that actions follow from the Commission on Diversity in the Public Realm. I think that's incredibly important. Just as a woman, I've felt for years the extent to which the public realm in London commemorates and glorifies so many men. But I'm not a person of color. But if I were, I would feel that twice as badly. The fact that there are so many people commemorated who are criminals, who've committed criminal acts against your people. I can't. Yes, these constant reminders in the public realm that your history doesn't matter, that someone else's history is dominant, does need to change. These things need to go into museums where they're in context, where we can learn from them, and that absolutely needs to happen. And the point about having a conversation that I keep talking about is to plan actions and to build consensus. At the moment, we've got the media trying to set everybody up against each other. The traditionalists who want things to never change and not think about their past are on one side, and the people who want to raise difficult questions are woke and on another side. There's a conflict. But actually, if we bring people together to talk and we ask everybody to think about what actions we take, the right answers will emerge, because there are right answers here. Human rights are a real thing. They can be measured. Every person's view counts when we're talking about how to enact them and make them real. And that is something that I think we'll get actions out of deliberative, conversational, creative processes working in collaboration like that will be long lasting and unanswerable. Nobody can just go, oh, that's just the woke, that's just one opinion. The answers that emerge from something like that will be something we can genuinely build on and put in stone, as it were. That's the wrong way to end that conversation. Put in stone the right answers. That's what I'm going to say.
And so I've got a question here which says, how will you support the education opportunities for Black Londoners, including what you will do to make sure that our histories are taught in schools? But I want to take that question a bit further as well. Mm-hmm. So we know that the exclusion rate, particularly for Black Caribbean boys, is, one of the highest and most disproportionate rates in the country, and it particularly affects London schools. And we have a kind of school to prison pipeline, exclusion to prison pipeline in the UK, which is not discussed and is kind of seen as an entirely American issue. And there's a kind of raise of, campaigns like No Exclusions and, the Advocacy Academy, who are trying to do work around, school exclusions of Black youth. How far would you go to making sure that you're protecting the educational opportunities of young Black Londoners? Would you perhaps even go as far as to outlaw exclusions or look to move away from that kind of model of discipline within schools?
Yeah, very much so. We've looked at that in the London Assembly and seen the extraordinary high levels of exclusions that there are. And I worry too about this idea that putting police in schools is a good idea. I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I think the right people to be in schools helping prevent trouble or helping people who might be, if there's anger and conflict within schools, I think the right people are youth workers. I don't understand why people think putting police officers in schools is a good idea. All that does is lead to the criminalization of young people at a much younger age, and it is this pipeline. And I argue in vain against this in the London Assembly, I have to say. Everybody thinks that a good idea is putting police in schools because it gets people used to talking to the police. But to my mind, that's about police's own PR. That's about making sure that they want to build trust in the police by making you familiar with the police. In an ideal world, nobody would come into contact with the police unless things have gone really badly wrong. And at a much earlier stage, you need to have people there to listen to young people and mentor them and make sure they know that they have options, and also inspire them to thrive, point them in the direction of new opportunities. That's what youth workers do. They're a really valuable service. And a police officer in a school just can't offer any of that, and in fact there's evidence that they get brought in to conflict situations far too easily, and that all these kind of institutional biases come to play in leading towards exclusions of Black pupils more often. And there you've got, then, like you say, there's a pipeline then of pushing people towards criminal justice system, which is absolutely unnecessary. So yes, I completely agree with all of that, and I would genuinely want to see from the police some kind of cost benefit analysis of the police officers in schools, because I think they'd be better spent somewhere else.
Right.
I've not heard anything from young people that they're valuable. I really haven't.
So I want to think about, the space of culture and black cultural events, particularly in London, and what tangible commitment can cultural events such as Sankofa Day in Trafalgar Square, the Hyde Park Memorial to victims of the slave trade, Africa in London, Notting Hill Carnival, and Windrush Day get from you to support this grassroots people's memorial beyond a verbal acknowledgement? How will you make sure that you're really, embedded in the culture of Black London? I want to zone in onto Notting Hill Carnival in particular, because every year that it does happen, there's always talked about people saying oh, it shouldn't come back, it's too much of a disturbance, even though its arrest rates are lower than things like Glastonbury Festival. And there's even concern sometimes that would it even return, or would the government use the pandemic and lockdown as an excuse to make sure that Carnival never happens again? There's always been this kind of like relentless assault on Carnival, and particularly on events of Black Caribbean, on just Caribbean heritage. So what kind of commitment can we have from you to know that you'll support these events, and also help to really solidify new days like Windrush Day or Stephen Lawrence Day or things like that?
So yeah, first of all, on the Notting Hill Carnival, I've been there when it's been threatened in the past. The Police and Crime Committee instituted a bit of a review of their own, and I was not a lone voice. Some of our other assembly members on the committee stood up, but I was one of a minority of people really pushing to make sure that the bottom line is this event goes ahead, that it doesn't get changed into a ticket only event, that it doesn't have its route changed. It grew up organically from our communities, and that needs to be 100% respected. And yeah, the idea, the fact that they also took the facial recognition to Notting Hill to test it, again, offensive and not right. And I've stood up against that in the assembly as well. Now, in terms of future events and having more public memorials and more spaces dedicated to Black history within London, I think that's incredibly important. I've worked within the planning rules for London. I've worked really hard and not quite got there yet, although there are some things that will help to try to protect and put into planning the protection of what I call our emerging heritage. So there's a lot of rules around the sort of official heritage bodies like Historic England, that things have to be a certain age, they have to be certain oldness before they get protected, or they have to have sort of aesthetic or architectural value and be things that need protecting. And I think there are lots of things within London that are incredibly valuable, that are springing up from minority communities that need that same level of protection as a thing as a building does. And that's what I've been trying to put into planning. So the examples are things like the businesses that are based on sort of Latin American and South American communities around Elephant and Castle, the market that's at Ward's Corner in Seven Sisters, that's a proper Latin market. Now these things are under threat from big development, and so the planning rules need to be protecting that emerging heritage, that organic clusters of businesses that form the create character for the area, but also a real resource for a minority community within London. And it has London-wide value for a community that maybe lives in lots of different places around London, to have cultural centres and things like that are protected. So I'm going to try my best to try to make sure that this works. And the LGBTIQA plus community have the same issues as well. And again, protecting places like Soho, protecting individual venues like the Royal Vauxhall Tavern have been something we've worked on, precedents and things that we can do to expand that, to cover more things that are springing up from our more recent migrant communities that deserve protection, even though they're not 100 years old.
And so I want to think about one of the biggest issues which is facing young Black Londoners at the moment, and that is rising living costs. Often on social media, I see conversations with people saying that, it breaks my heart, but I might have to leave the place that I've always called home because I can no longer afford it. And what do you plan to do from housing to transport to council tax to make sure that London is affordable for young Black Londoners and that we're not being forced out and forced to move to areas that we don't want to?
A lot of my work is on housing and trying to prevent the breakup of communities on estates. I've managed to get a big U-turn out of the current mayor, who was producing new guidance for estate regeneration. And the first draft of that said there will be no ballots for residents, that residents won't have this power to vote and decide against schemes that might demolish their homes. And there was a big campaign. Estate residents, renters groups, and groups from all around London banded together and wrote in their thousands to this consultation and said, no, we want to have a policy for ballots. And yeah, the mayor did listen to this, and this was a big U-turn that I fought for. And I'm going to be making those rules even more strict to give people even more power and more protection as well. So I think that's really important. I'm also going to have a People's Land Commission, and that is because a ballot is, ballot to say no to something is all very well, but what you really want is the plans coming up from the bottom up, so that communities are planning for the housing they and their children need in a local area, and so that we're not just resisting things that are being imposed on us from the top down. And the People's Land Commission would do that. It would help every community in London to make plans for their local area, things they want to protect, areas where they'd like to see new housing, what kinds of new housing they'd like in those areas, and other things that they would like. So more community centres, or more shops, or playgrounds, or green space, or whatever. Things need to be planned from the bottom up, in my view, and I think that's really important. And then on overall living costs, I fought really hard. It took me 3 years to get the current mayor to start talking about rent controls at all. On the BBC debate recently, he was asked to say, what of any other candidates' policies do you like? And he said Siân Berry's policy of rent controls. It's a good one. And this is right. I pushed him to do that. And we really need those powers. The next mayor needs to work with mayors of other cities to get the powers for cities to set rent controls, because at the moment, this is part of the human right to housing, is to not be forced out by a rent hike, to not be driven out of your community in that way, and it doesn't exist. We can put that in place in London. That's really important. And finally, on transport, you mentioned transport. I want to reduce the fares for everybody in outer London, because one of the symptoms of being forced out away from the centre of town, if your job is in the centre of town, which a lot of low paid people do work in the centre of London and have to live far out, you pay more in fares. And nobody apart from me seems to be questioning this system of zones where when you live further out, you pay more. I think there should be a flat fare for London, and I'm going to work towards having one zone as quickly as I possibly can once I'm mayor, because that is, to me, just something that's wrong with the current system, wrong in principle, and needs to be fixed.
Great. So final question. If elected as mayor, what will you do to tackle the increasing cases of Londoners living in terrible quality of housing due to neglect from housing associations, landlords and councils? I mean, I think the most high profile case recently have been the social housing conditions of tenants in Croydon, where, it was, indescribably awful, the kind of conditions that they were living in. How will you intervene to make sure that there is, safe, clean, universal housing for people in London?
So very importantly, my answer to this is not sort of patrician top down. I will make sure it's all fixed on your behalf. I want to give social tenants much more power over their homes, much more power to hold their landlords accountable. And so for that, I'm going to have a social housing commissioner for London who will be a tenant. I will make sure they've got funding to be able to support a really thriving community of tenants and residents groups representing people on the ground, making sure their voices are heard. I visited it's Regina House in Croydon, talked to some of the residents, and they were all, I mean, obviously lockdown doesn't help, but they were all felt like they were on their own, trying to talk to their landlord about getting things fixed. And I think, what everybody in blocks like that needs is a thriving, well-supported tenants association who they can go to, and when they all realise they're all having the same problem, go to the council with one voice, threaten them with bad publicity, also, you know, have genuine methods of holding the landlords accountable and get things fixed for themselves. This is a system change that needs to happen. The power balance needs to shift between landlords and tenants. Otherwise, we'll just be left effectively, you know, firefighting each individual problem. We do need to fix the system here. And for too long, it's been top down and not bottom up.
Great, thank you. I like that answer, and I like the idea of it being, you know, local, democratic, and consultative. Thank you so much to the Green Party candidate Siân Berry for joining me, and thank you to you for watching. Voting for the 2021 London mayoral election takes place on Thursday, the 7th of May 2021. Please look at your local government website for details of your nearest polling station, and you can follow the Black Culture Archives on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at @BCA Heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you.